Preserving historic sites can help us understand change, and in Boston, that especially goes for the change from loyal British colony into a spearhead in the struggle for independence. Part of the transformation took place near the old State House at the scene of the Boston Massacre, where the first person killed by British soldiers was a man of mixed race, Crispus Attucks. But through a lens of upheaval during the past year, events of the late 1700s can assume new contours and invite new questions. That's part of the reason for a series of virtual events organized by a nonprofit connected with historic sites, Revolutionary Spaces. To tell us about the series is its president and CEO, Nat Sheidly. Thank you very much for being with us, Nat.
Hi, Chris. It's nice to be here.
Now, the last time we saw you, you were just about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre with a lot of focus on Crispus Attucks. What's happened since then, especially with your observance, I guess, of the 251st anniversary?
Right. Well, Chris, we obviously 2020, which was the 250th anniversary year, unfolded a little bit differently than we had anticipated. And so we've taken what was meant to be a year of in-person programs and explorations of this history and the way that it's been remembered. We turned it into a series of virtual programs. And unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen over the past year is just how relevant the story of Crispus Attucks has been. I mean, the programming that we've done really was meant to frame a conversation about how the memory of Attucks has been part of our ongoing struggle for racial and social justice, and so it felt acutely relevant during the past year.
Well, the event in 1770, you had a protest that might have gotten out of hand, and then you had some excessive use of force by the British. So, how did that look to people who might have been involved more recently in protests here in Boston?
Well, I think it's raised all sorts of questions in people's minds about, what happens when we live in an occupied city. What is the nature of the relationship between the civilian population and authorities of the state? But more importantly, I think it's framed for us a series of important questions about the way in which the memory of sacrifices made in the past can be turned into a touchstone for developing a sense of common purpose and a kind of engine for change in the world that we want to live in tomorrow.
Well, John Adams called the Boston Massacre a sort of seminal event on the path to independence. And one of the things that your website at Revolutionary Spaces has been able to let us do is look more closely at what was going on in 1770, especially at Crispus Attucks, because he's a person of mixed race. On either side of his family, people who were not treated very well by the white colonists, and at the same time, he seems to be rising up against the British. So, what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the Attucks is a really fascinating point of entry into the world of late colonial Massachusetts, and the folks who pushed for independence. Attucks was of mixed ancestry of both African and Native American descent. He ran away, liberated himself from slavery as a young man, found his way to sea, made a life for himself at sea. And we can only guess at what might have motivated him to be in the square on the night of March 5th, 1770. But we do know that he stood at the center of three overlapping struggles for freedom that defined the 18th century.
We'll talk about overlapping struggles. Another important figure that you're looking at is Prince Hall. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, Prince Hall is sometimes remembered as the father of Black Freemasonry, but he was part of Boston's very dynamic African American community during the 1760s and 1770s. And he was the lead signer on several petitions that were brought before the provincial government that demanded an end to the slave trade and to the institution of slavery. Those petitions were heard in the old state house, the townhouse, as it was called at the time. And I think they're still relevant today. Chris, one of the things that interests me about those anti-slavery petitions is that even before the Declaration of Independence was written, Prince Hall and the other signers of these petitions were using the natural rights language that Thomas Jefferson would use in 1776. So it just shows us the power of those words, the power of those ideas, and helps us to understand that they were deployed by many people.
What's interesting about what Prince Hall was doing, this is in 1774, he petitioned the governor, but the governor, this wasn't like Charlie Baker or Mike Dukakis. This was a military commander who was coming down very harshly on the colonies. What was he thinking?
Well, I mean, there's long tradition of petitioning for redress of grievances within the Anglo-American political tradition. So I think he was thinking that he would use whatever tools were available to him at the time. But of course, you know, the role that the institution of slavery played in the collapse of the British Empire and the dynamics of the war itself were extremely freighted. So perhaps he was thinking he might find an ally in a place where one might not have been found if it hadn't been for military rule.
Well, where there's history, there's also mythology and propaganda, because I know in the case of the Boston Massacre, some people might dispute how important that was as far as a revolutionary act per se. But the figure of Crispus Attucks, I mean, what became of him later on?
Well, Attucks is a touchstone for generations of activists who are looking for inspiration. Most notably, the African-American abolitionists, many of them here in Boston, who elevated Attucks into a central figure in the story of the nation's founding, where he had been mostly forgotten prior to the 1840s and the 1850s. And their interest in doing that is bound up with the politics of slavery right before the Civil War. Slaveholders in the South and their allies often said slavery couldn't be ended because you couldn't make citizens out of former slaves. And they argued that they weren't capable of sacrificing on behalf of the nation. So Black abolitionists hold up Attucks and say, well, here's somebody who sacrificed first, right? And if you need any further evidence, you know, this is a powerful example that others have had to live up to. So, and that comes right down to the 21st century activists pointing to Attucks as a kind of inspiration for the cause of racial justice.
And tracking back, you see him held up by Melnia Cass, but even further back by John Boyle O'Reilly, another kind of insurgent.
Yeah, that's right. So O'Reilly, of course, is an Irish Bostonian, Irish American Bostonian, and writes an enduring poem about Attucks and his legacy. And I think, you know, we have on the Common in Boston the monument that many people refer to as the Boston Massacre Memorial, but it's a memorial to Crispus Attucks, and it was put there really through the political common cause made by people, by African Americans and Irish Americans in Boston in the 1870s and the 1880s. It's a fascinating story to explore.
You know, you came into your position more than a year ago, heading an organization that mainly engages people by events at buildings. Now you've been doing it online. How has that been working out as far as getting people to plug in?
You know, we've had a lot of success with the virtual programming that we've done, and we've tried to take a variety of different approaches to it. I mean, I think we're all experiencing a little bit of Zoom fatigue at this late date in the pandemic. But one of the great opportunities that doing virtual programming gave us is the opportunity to draw on participants from all over the country in a way that we might not otherwise have been able to do. So we did a series of about 10 panel discussions to explore our exhibit reflecting Attucks, and we've drawn on participants from all over the country. And in fact, one participant came to us from Africa. And, you know, there's no way that we would have been able to bring all those folks into dialogue if it hadn't been for the virtual platform.
Well, I know there's a lot more agreement historically about the Boston Tea Party as an igniting kind of event. And you have another kind of way of covering that in your program. And this is almost like a late night talk show. How do you get a tea party into a talk show?
Yeah, well, we run a series of programs called Tea Party Tonight, which uses the late night talk show format to explore history. It's meant to be light and fun, but also to engage in a serious exploration of the past. And not all of it is about the Tea Party, but ultimately, we hope when we're back to doing in-person programming that we'll be able to host those live in Old South Meeting House, which is, of course, where the tea meeting that became the Tea Party took place.
We should mention there is something that's going to be going on tonight about Prince Hall. If people want to find out about that or maybe watch, is there some way they can find that?
Yeah, we have a virtual performance of our play, The Petition, which dramatizes Prince Hall and the anti-slavery petition of 1774. That's going to be at 7 o'clock tonight, and people can get information about that by going to our website at revolutionaryspaces.org. They can also find out more information about how to sign up for Tea Party Tonight on March 31st.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Nat Sheidly from Revolutionary Spaces. We'll have more news in just a moment.